I'm Paul Robbins, and welcome to another Community Window for KCSG TV. We're here today in a beautiful setting out here at the Sand Hollow Reservoir, and we're very fortunate to have the head, or the director, of the Washington County Water Conservancy District. Mr. Ron Thompson is going to be with us for the next half hour. I'd like to introduce him now. Ron, thank you for being with us on our show.
Thank you, Paul.
We appreciate you coming out here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been here since the early 1970s when Washington County was a fairly small, sleepy community. Came here to practice law, served as a county attorney for 4 years, and then became involved with the Water Conservancy District in the early 1980s and have been working with them ever since.
We've seen quite a bit of expansion since that time.
We have. In fact, Quail Creek, which is just here to the north of us, was our first project, which we built in the early 1980s.
What actually directed you toward the Water Conservancy kind of work?
And I remember as a young boy coming to Washington County, particularly in the St. George area, my grandparents were on, it seemed like in the 50s, were on restrictions every summer where they couldn't water their lawns. They wouldn't even let you run the tap to get a cold drink of water. You had to go to the fridge and get the pitcher. And so it was always impressed on me the importance of water, particularly in the desert, in this area, and I realized that to grow we had to have water. So I took an early interest in terms of how we were going to get the water, and you know, one thing led to another. Back then, actually the district court judges appointed the boards of these districts, and I suspect I really ended up being involved after many philosophical discussions with the district court judge about water and how it ought to be developed. And next thing I knew, he'd gone to this board and asked them to hire me to help them get some things done, and I've been there ever since.
Well, obviously you've done a great job. I've never been in a community, and I've lived in a few here and in other states, that really we don't seem to have any water problems.
Well, so far we've been lucky to stay ahead of the curve.
And how does that look for the future?
I think it looks good. You know, right now we've got I think a reasonable supply in front of us. We're doing some local projects, and then of course we have a big project we're working on the horizon that will take this community out towards hopefully closer to a build-out scenario.
Well, actually today, Ron, we're here to talk about something that I'd like to myself learn a little bit about, and that's that Lake Powell pipe, the pipeline that is going to be bringing potentially a lot of water into this area. How did that all begin?
Well, you know, it really started in the early 1990s, and we have, for a long time, our district has worked closely with the state in developing a water plan for southwest Utah and the Virgin River Basin. In the early 1990s, I received a phone call from Larry Anderson, who was the director of water resources, and I'll never forget, he says, "Ron, you know, with all the issues you have and all the growth and the nature of the Virgin River and the endangered species, we ought to look at another source of water, and Utah's got a lot of water in Lake Powell. I think you ought to be looking at a pipeline." And I remember the first time, because Larry was a good friend, he said, "Larry, I think you're nuts." And he says, "Well, Ron, I'm going to do some work with our engineers, and I'll come back and then let's talk." So he did. And then he convinced us to fund a study, and the more we've studied it, the more it looks like a reliable, firm supply of water, which this area needs, dramatically needs.
Well, now for someone like myself who really is not conversant with water rights, how is it that Utah has rights to water in Lake Powell?
Well, of course, the Colorado River is a source of water to maybe 25 million people today, but in the 1920s, there was a compact entered into between the 7 Colorado River Basin states with the federal government. And that compact allocated the water between what they called the upper basin, which was Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and the lower basin, which was Arizona, Nevada, and California. And of course, since then, those states have had some assurance that their respective shares would be honored. And in the upper basin, they allocated the water between those 4 states based on percentages. Utah has probably about 400,000 acre-foot of water that's undeveloped in the Colorado River. 100,000 has been allocated to this project.
Ron, you know, people are interested in living in the desert, We do have reservoirs around us, but should we be concerned about water, particularly in the future? There is obvious growth in our community, and we anticipate more, I expect.
Yeah, well, certainly, water is I often say water is the grease that makes the economy run and survive, and certainly no economy can grow beyond its water supply. And so water is critically important in the desert. It's important that we use it correctly, that we use it wisely, and that we develop adequate supplies not only for ourselves but for future generations.
Well, obviously the board has done a terrific job in terms of supply with the reservoirs, and we'll be talking about the pipeline in just a moment, but conservation itself, how concerned should we be about watering our lawns and maybe putting in different kinds of landscaping?
Well, I think we need to be very concerned about the conservation. It should be part of our ethic. We live in the desert. We need to use water wisely. And the district certainly has been concerned about educating people to the wise use of water. In our society today, here we use over 60% of our water for outside landscaping. That's probably way too much. We need to learn to use it more efficiently. We're making great strides in terms of conservation and new construction with water-wise fixtures and appliances, but we need to do much more in our outdoor landscaping. Use more plants that are sensitive to the desert environment, use less water. You can still have beautiful landscaping and be sensitive to what will grow in the desert with less water.
Well, while we're on that topic, just say for instance I wanted to know what plants I should plant, how I can conserve water. Is there some outlet with the board that would help me with that?
Yeah, we have a water conservation program and a full-time water conservation coordinator, and she's will come and do landscape audits and has a list of plants that grow well in our climate. And she's available to the public. We also have people who will come to your yard and look at your irrigation system and how efficient it is. And we have classes. We actually have a demonstration garden where people come. We're working on a new desert educational garden center to the west of the new Water Conservancy District building with St. George City. And we think that we're going to provide some place where people can come and get the knowledge to be more efficient with their landscaping.
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that we're spoiled with the great job that you guys have done in terms of providing water for us. But yet you have plans for the future, and I'd like to kind of move into that now with regard to Lake Powell. We do have, I guess, rights to a pretty good portion of that water. We're talking about a pipeline.
Yeah, the pipeline will actually take the water out of Lake Powell near the Glen Canyon Dam. It will follow the highway route up along US 89 that goes from Page to Kanab. Then it will drop down south of Fredonia and back along the state line, and will drop here off of this Hurricane Cliffs and come into this reservoir. There will be 4 pump stations as we take the water out of the reservoir and lift it, and then there will be a series of hydro plants as we pick that energy back up. The thing about this project, we got a fairly high pump lift on the east side of the project. So we come out of Lake Powell and we've got a very large, a 3,500 foot drop as that water drops through the high point back into this reservoir here. So we hope to produce 50 or 60 megawatts of regular power, and we're also looking fairly hard at a 300 megawatt pump storage project as part of the Lake Powell project.
What is the elevation difference between, for instance, this reservoir right here in Lake Powell?
Oh, Lake Powell's about 700-800 foot higher than this.
But you have to climb over hills and mountains to get here.
We actually go up to about almost 6,000, 5,700 feet, and then it drops back into this reservoir from there.
And what's the total length of that pipe?
About 130, a little over 130 miles.
My goodness. But it ends right here at this reservoir?
It will end here at Sand Hollow Reservoir. And actually, there are 2 other counties involved, so there's some leg that will go up in Iron County and a small leg into Kanab area.
And your projections in terms of the needs we have for water, is that going to satisfy that?
Well, it will certainly for the immediate future. Obviously, it depends on where we ultimately grow to. It's likely we continue to grow. You've got an organic growth rate, new births and over deaths here of about 2%. And then you have, look around, you've got the greatest climate in the world. And so as you look at our county and what's going on, and you've got great medical facilities, a great climate, it's hard to not imagine that we're going to continue to grow. And most of the projections project this Sun Belt, Rocky Mountain area to continue to be the fastest growing region in the United States, and I think that's probably true.
So we shouldn't anticipate any real problems, at least for the next 20 years or 50 years?
Well, Lake Powell water supply will take us out to someplace close to 2040. At that junction, we're going to have to look at some other options.
Well, let's talk about another option in terms of what I understand to be a pretty large aquifer that apparently we're standing on right here. Tell us a little bit about that. Is that water that's available now? Are we using that water?
Well, we are using the water, and it's an important source. We're on the Navajo Sandstone Aquifer here. In fact, Sand Hollow Reservoir sits right on top of, underneath this reservoir, there's about 1,200 feet of fairly porous sandstone. One of the important parts about this is we actually recharge this sandstone aquifer and then pump it back out. And so today we have stored here about 75,000 acre-foot of water that's under us. The reservoir, when full, stores 50,000. So you can see it's a very important aquifer. We have a series of wells, and we'll continue to drill more, so we can use this water as we need it. And so when there's droughts and so forth, we'll pump this aquifer hard. When there's not droughts, we'll fill it back up and operate it like an additional reservoir.
Ron, other than the aquifer we just talked about, most of this water, I'm assuming, particularly the Lake Powell water, is Colorado River water. Tell us a little bit about that in terms of its source, our rights to it, and basically what it's costing us to bring that water into here.
Of course, we're all in the Colorado River Basin. Washington County, for the most part, is in the lower basin of Colorado River. But as part of the compact, Utah had an allocation of water. Today, there's well over 400,000 acre-foot a year that comes into Lake Powell that is Utah's water. A portion that's been allocated to this. It's interesting because when you look at Lake Powell and the source of water in the Colorado River, we've just come through in the early 1990s as the most severe drought they recorded really since they started keeping records. And yet, at the end of that drought, the lake was still full, and the lower basin had 100% allocation. And so it's a fairly good, reliable source of water. And I often hear people say, well, we're going to have something that will cause it to dry up. And I think, well, if it dries up the Colorado River, what's it going to do to the Virgin River, which is our primary source today? And certainly as a water manager, our concern is when people turn on their tap, there's water. And so you want in your toolbox water from as many sources as you can. Lake Powell is one of those tools. Virgin River's a tool. Our springs are tools. Our wells are tools. All of which we use to adaptively manage our water resources for the people who need it and use it.
Some of us are old enough to remember rafting down the Colorado at a time when there wasn't a Lake Powell, which doesn't seem too long ago for some of us. But now that we do have the lake, obviously a great source of water, yet there's some controversy in terms of keeping that lake. I mean, we've had a lot of pressure from certain sources to empty that lake and bring it back to its natural state, which I understand is improbable. But what would happen if we lost Lake Powell?
Well, the impact would be catastrophic, particularly the upper basin. As part of the compact, there was an agreement that you would have Lake Powell and you'd have a large lake in the upper basin, which would allow the lower basin to get their allocation without impairing the ability of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico to take their allocation. So it would create not only the loss of a huge power source and a huge water source, but it would certainly turn upside down the compact and how it was operated. I really don't see that happening. There's just too many economic drivers that are dependent on Lake Powell being there and performing the function it performs today.
Most of us don't really consider where all this water comes from, but where does where does the Colorado River come from? I mean, where does the water source for that?
Well, it starts clear up in the high mountains in Colorado and Utah and Wyoming, and some in New Mexico, and then drains from there back down Ironically, most of the water in the Colorado River is made in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado, and half of it gets used in the lower basin in Nevada, Arizona, and California, and the other half is retained for use in the upper basin states.
Well, talking about water rights, we have the Virgin River flowing right through our community. It's always been a curiosity to me as to how much water we can retain or keep on that river. I know that some of it we have to let flow through, but what's the, if you will, the allocation of that water?
Well, most of the water is allocated to Washington County. The problem, obviously, you have this kind of a system is that there's no on-stream reservoirs, and frankly, I don't know of any really good on-stream site if you could have one. So most of this water that comes off the Virgin River comes in March, April, May, and some early June, and then you have a small base flow. When you have reservoirs like this, you're restricted by the size of your pipeline. So we have a 5.5 and a 6-foot pipeline that feeds Sand Hollow and Quail Creek, and we're pretty much limited to the capacity of those pipelines to how much we can pull out of the river. And the big flows are there so seldom that you really can't economically justify bigger pipelines to capture the water.
So, in other words, the use of that water, or drawing it out of the river, we're limited only by how we can store it.
Yeah, storage, and we're limited by geology. It doesn't let it. And then, frankly, we've got 6 native species in this river, 2 of which are listed as endangered, so they have a certain call on water. And so there are a lot of competing sources for the water of the Virgin River.
Speaking of sources and where we're storing it, I understand there's a couple more reservoirs in mind in the future that you're going to be developing?
Yeah, we're working right now on the preliminary engineering on a reservoir that has been talked about actually for decades here out in the Warner Valley area. That primarily would be used to help supplement and supply water for secondary water. It would be a reservoir roughly the size of Sand Hollow. And then a smaller reservoir up by Anderson Junction where we'll take the water out of Ash Creek Reservoir, which is up at the top of the Black Ridge, and bring it down a pipeline and then tie it into that east side of the county, which will firm up some of their water supply in that area. Both of those projects are in environmental review right now.
Well, let's talk about the costs. How's this all being paid for? What's the expense to us as a community and individually?
Well, we have adopted a policy some time ago that new growth would pay for new water sources, and that's how we plan to pay for all of these projects, is through the impact fees on new growth, and we'll have plans that will develop as growth occurs. Lake Powell was created as a state water project here a few years ago. There are 2 of those designated projects. One is the Lake Powell project, the other is the Bear River project. Today, most of the money that's been spent on developing this project is coming from a funding source which is dedicated to these 2 state projects. Ultimately, the project will be allocated between Iron Cane and Washington County, Washington County having the predominant share of that. The state will initially fund the project, or that's the commitment, and then it will have to be repaid by the water users of those 3 counties. We intend to repay the Washington County share out of impact fees as new growth occurs. The state has laid out a long-term financing concept which we think is doable and still allows reasonable growth to occur without putting an undue burden on the existing users who are here.
It seems to be very reasonable in terms of the expense to the consumer for water here. Am I correct in that assumption?
No, water has always been in this country the best buy we have. You know, it's you look at we're buying thousands of gallons of water for what we pay for 1 gallon of gasoline, if to kind of make a comparison. But our water has always been reasonably priced. You know, there's certainly as you look at the economics, you know, a society really needs to have a thriving economy. 2 things: it needs reasonably priced water, and it needs reasonably priced and abundant supply of energy. With both of those, then most economies will do fairly well over time. You take either one of them out, and they struggle. But water has been reasonably inexpensive, and frankly, when you compare Lake Powell project to many projects being planned around the West today, it's economically cost-effective. while it will end up costing us about $10,000 an acre foot of water, the capital cost to get that water into these 3 counties, that's still less than you're seeing. For example, the Nevada pipeline we talk about that goes up into Snake Valley and so forth, that's a $3.5 billion project for 40,000 acre foot of water. We're talking about a $1 billion project for 100,000 acre foot of water here.
That's going to be the cost of the Lake Powell pipeline, $1 billion. How's that going to affect our water costs as a consumer?
Well, our intent is to obviously have impact fees from new growth that will pay the capital cost, and it looks to us with the offsets from hydropower and power that while that water will cost slightly more than our existing water resources, it's not going to be a significant change in cost.
And what's the timeline on that construction?
And we feel like with the current growth scenario, we probably have a little more time than we thought we had back in here 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, but still this project needs to come online by the early 2020s, and it's probably about a 4-year project. So we hope to start construction around 2016 and have it completed and ready to deliver water by the early 2020s.
Wonderful. How big is this pipeline in terms of size, the actual diameter of the pipe itself? Is it above ground or is it below ground?
It'll be buried, so most people won't even know it's there. It'll be a buried pipeline. Today it's going to be, it looks like a 69-inch pipeline, so it's not quite 6 foot in diameter, and it will carry about 100,000 acre foot of water a year.
Well, that's exciting. I can't thank you enough, Ron, for being with us today. Hopefully we can do some more shows in the future. This is obviously a very, very important part of our lives here in southern Utah.
I used to have an old board member who used to say, a very wise old board member, and he used to say, you know, says, I can get by without my TV, and I can get by without my phone, and I can get by without my car, but I can't get by without my water.